On the 14th of February, 2024, at 1841 Greenwich Mean Time, every light in Reykjavik went out. Not flickered, not dimmed, went out. The substations didn't trip. The geothermal plants at Hellisheidi and Nesjavellir kept spinning. The national grid, Landsnet, recorded no interruption of service. According to every instrument that mattered, Reykjavik never lost power. But it did. For 9 minutes, the capital city of Iceland, home to 140,000 people, 2/3 of the nation's entire population, sat in absolute darkness. And when the lights returned at 1850, nobody outside the city limits noticed anything had happened. Because according to the data, nothing did. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I'm not here to tell you what I think this was. I'm here to tell you what the records show, what the witnesses reported, and what one woman did when the city decided to forget. Her name was Hildur Ólafsdóttir. She was 51 years old. She'd been an emergency room nurse at Landspítali, the National University Hospital, for 23 years. She wasn't a scientist. She wasn't a conspiracy theorist. She was a woman who'd spent 2 decades holding pressure on wounds and reading monitors. And when the numbers stopped making sense, she didn't look away. That's the whole story, really. One nurse who didn't look away. At 1841 on that Tuesday evening, Hildur was 11 hours into a 12-hour shift in the Landspítali emergency department. February in Iceland means darkness by mid-afternoon, so the fluorescents had been doing the heavy lifting since about 3 o'clock. The ER was running at typical winter capacity. 13 patients in various stages of treatment, 2 in the resuscitation bay, the rest distributed across curtained bays and the short-stay observation ward. The power cut was instantaneous. Not a brownout, not a stagger. The fluorescents didn't flicker or cycle down. One moment the emergency department was bathed in that flat, institutional light that makes everyone look slightly dead. The next moment, darkness so complete that Hildur said she couldn't see her own hand against her face. Now hospitals have backup generators. Landspítali's are diesel, rated to kick in within 10 seconds of a mains failure. They didn't. Not at 10 seconds, not at 30, not at a minute. Hildur counted. She told me later that counting was the only thing that kept her from screaming, because in 23 years, the generators had never failed. Not once. Not during the 2008 financial collapse. Not during the worst North Atlantic storms. Never. The battery-operated emergency lights activated as designed. Small, dim, red-lensed units mounted near the floor enough to sketch the edges of doorways, and not much else. In that thin red glow, Hildur moved by memory. Bay 4 needed a ventilator check. Bay 7 had an elderly man on supplemental oxygen. The resuscitation bay held 2 critical patients on SC monitoring equipment that was now running on internal battery backup, which was rated for maybe 20 minutes. She made it to the resuscitation bay in under a minute. The cardiac monitors were running on battery. Both patients, a 58-year-old man in the middle of a suspected STEMI and a 19-year-old woman who'd been pulled from an overturned car on Blackout, showed stable rhythms. Then, at 1843, 2 minutes into the blackout, something happened that Hildur did not have a framework for. 11 patients flatlined simultaneously. Not in the resuscitation bay, across the department. 11 of the 13 patients currently in the emergency department went into cardiac arrest at the same moment. Hildur heard the alarms the monitors were on battery, so their speakers still worked and the sound was wrong. Not the staggered, isolated beeping she'd spent decades responding to. A chorus. 11 separate monitors producing 11 identical alarm tones at the same instant, creating a single, continuous, harmonized drone that filled the dark emergency department like a pipe organ. She ran. She got to Bay 3 first, a 40-year-old woman being treated for a fractured radius, a systole, flat line, no pulse. Hildur started compressions, shouting for help, and 2 of the other nurses found her in the red half-light. They split up. Everyone was running. But here's what Hildur noticed. Even in the chaos, even pumping someone's chest in near total darkness, the 11 patients who had arrested were not dying. Their monitors showed a systole. Their radial pulses were absent. By every clinical definition, they were in cardiac arrest. But their skin was warm. Their color, what she could see of it under the red emergency lights, was normal. No cyanosis, no mottling. And when she paused compressions for a pulse check after 2 minutes, which felt like 20, the woman in Bay 3 opened her eyes. Not gasping, not seizing. She opened her eyes calmly, looked at Hildur, and said in perfectly clear Icelandic, "Eg hef aldrei sed svo mor ljós." I have never seen so many lights. The woman's monitor still read a systole. Hildur's fingers were on her carotid. No pulse, but the woman was conscious, lucid, and calm. Hildur did what any good nurse would do. She assumed equipment failure. The monitors were on battery. The batteries could be old, and the leads could have loosened when the patients moved. The electrical interference from whatever had killed the mains could be throwing artifacts. She ran a manual check. Blood pressure cuff, stethoscope, pen light. The woman in Bay 3 had no measurable blood pressure. Absent heart sounds on auscultation. Pupils equal and reactive to light. Skin warm and dry. She was speaking in full sentences. She wanted to know if her husband had been called about the wrist. Across the department, the same scene was unfolding 11 times. 11 patients, monitors reading flatline. No detectable cardiac output, all of them conscious. Some were sitting up. One man in Bay 9, a 67-year-old, being held for observation after a syncopal episode, had gotten off his stretcher and was standing at the window. The 2 patients in the resuscitation bay, the STEMI and the car accident, were the only ones whose monitors had not changed. Their hearts continued beating normally throughout. Hildur found Magnus Bjarnason, the attending physician on duty, at the nursing station. He was holding a stethoscope and staring at nothing. She asked him what was happening. He said, "I've checked 4 of them. There's nothing wrong with them except they're dead." At 18:47, 6 minutes into the blackout, the man at the window in Bay 9 called out. Several staff members went to him. He was pointing outside. The cloud cover was gone. Every person I've spoken to who was conscious in Reykjavik during those 9 minutes describes the same thing when they talk about the sky. I'll use Hildur's words, because she was precise and because she was not, by nature, a person given to poetry. The clouds had been solid all day. Standard February overcast, maybe 200 meters. When I looked out the window, there were no clouds. There was no atmosphere. I don't mean clear sky, I mean the sky was not there. I was looking directly into space, and it was not far away. It looked like I could reach into it. The stars were not points. They had dimension. I could see color in them. I could see depth. It was like looking into a room instead of at a ceiling. 17 staff members and patients saw this. Their descriptions are consistent to a degree that is, frankly, uncomfortable. Stars with visible dimension. Depth in the field. Color, not the faint twinkle of red and blue you sometimes get on a clear night, but saturated structural color, as if the stars were objects with surfaces rather than points of light. The Icelandic Meteorological Office shows solid cloud cover over Reykjavik for the entire evening. Satellite thermal imaging confirms this. At no point did the cloud layer break. At 1850, 9 minutes after it began, the lights came back. Same as they went, no flicker, no surge, just instant restoration. The fluorescents were on. The ventilators hummed back to life. The diesel generators coughed and caught and then shut down again when they detected mains power, as designed. And 11 monitors began showing normal sinus rhythm. Hildur checked the woman in Bay 3. Blood pressure 118/74. Heart rate 72. Strong radial pulse. The woman blinked at the fluorescence and said her wrist was hurting again. Now, if this were just a power outage and some strange anecdotal reports, you wouldn't be hearing about it. Anecdotes don't survive institutional scrutiny. What survived was the water. Reykjavik's district heating system runs on geothermal water. This is not a small operation. The city heats virtually every building, homes, offices, hospitals, swimming pools, using water drawn from deep boreholes, heated by volcanic geology, and distributed through a network of pipes and pumping stations managed by Vetur, the municipal utility. During winter, this system is under constant, heavy demand. Every liter is accounted for. Flow rates, reservoir levels, pumping volumes. It's metered down to the cubic meter. On the morning of February 15th, a hydrologist named Thora Sigurdardóttir at Vetur noticed a discrepancy in the Perlan reservoir data. The reservoir, that distinctive glass-domed building on Öskjuhlid Hill that tourists photograph, constantly sits on top of 6 massive hot water tanks that serve as the primary thermal storage for the city's heating network. The discrepancy was simple. Between 1841 and 1850, on the 14th, the reservoir showed an 83,700 cubic meter surplus. In plain language, during those 9 minutes, the city's heating system consumed almost 84,000 fewer cubic meters of hot water than it should have. The pumps ran. The flow meters registered normal throughput. But the reservoir didn't drop. It was as if, for 9 minutes, Reykjavik stopped needing heat. Thora filed an internal anomaly report. This is routine at Vetur. Discrepancies happen, sensors glitch, a valve gets stuck. Someone investigates, writes it up. The system gets recalibrated. What was not routine was what Thora found when she tried to reconcile the data. The flow meters at the distribution substations showed normal output. Water left the reservoir at the expected rate. But the endpoint consumption data, the building level meters, showed near zero draw for the same 9-minute window. The water went into the pipes and didn't come out. Or it went into the pipes, reached the buildings, and wasn't consumed. Or the meters failed. 17,000 endpoint meters don't fail simultaneously. And the water didn't stay in the pipes. There was no pressure anomaly, no thermal buildup, no expansion event. The water just wasn't needed. Thora cross-referenced outdoor temperature data. February 14th was cold, -7 Celsius. Moderate wind, a standard for Reykjavik in winter. Heating demand should have been at peak. Instead, for 9 minutes, the thermal load on the city's geothermal system dropped to effectively zero. She told me months later, when I reached her by email, that she'd initially assumed a SCADA error, the supervisory control system that manages the network. I spent 3 days checking the logging firmware. The data was clean, the timestamps were valid. I wrote it up as an unexplained anomaly and moved on. What else was I supposed to do? What she didn't know at the time was that Hildur Ólafsdóttir was 50 minutes into a very different kind of documentation. Hildur went off shift at 1900, 10 minutes after the lights came back. She went home, sat at her kitchen table, and wrote down everything she had observed, in the clinical notation style she used for patient charts. Objective findings only, no interpretation. She wrote for 2 hours. She filled 11 pages of an A4 notebook. Each patient got a section: bay number, presenting complaint, vital signs pre-event, observations during the blackout, vital signs post-event. She noted the synchronized arrest time, the absence of cardiac output with preserved consciousness, the statements patients had made, the sky as observed from the ER windows. At the bottom of the 11th page, she wrote a single line that I think about often. 11 patients with no cardiac output maintained full consciousness for approximately 7 minutes. I cannot explain this. I am not sure it needs to be explained. I am sure it needs to be recorded. She went to sleep. The next morning, she drove back to Landspitali and requested the electronic medical records for all 13 patients who had been in the emergency department during the blackout. The records for the 9-minute window were gone. Not corrupted, not redacted, gone. The EMR system, Sogukirfi, the National Electronic Health Record Platform, showed a continuous record for each patient with a 9-minute gap. Vital signs before 1841, vital signs after 1850. The intervals simply didn't exist. Hildur went to the IT department. She spoke with a systems administrator named Erikur, who told her the gap was consistent across the entire hospital, not just the ER, every patient, in every ward. 9 minutes of absent data. He said this was consistent with a system clock error during a power interruption, and that it was nothing to worry about. She asked why the battery-backed monitoring systems, which she had personally witnessed functioning during the blackout, hadn't written any data. He said the battery backups maintain real-time display, but don't always write to the central database during mains failure. She asked if he'd checked. He said the issue had been escalated and resolved. Hildur left the IT department and went to find the patients. She started with Bay 3, the fractured radius. The woman had been discharged that morning. Hildur pulled her contact information from the chart and called her. The woman remembered the power going out. She remembered it coming back on. She did not remember opening her eyes, speaking to Hildur, or anything about lights. She said it had been a bit annoying, actually, sitting in the dark with a broken wrist. Hildur called 4 more patients that afternoon. All 5 reported the same thing. They remembered the blackout. They remembered it ending. The interval was blank. When Hildur described what she'd observed, the flat lines, the lucidity, the things they'd said, there was polite confusion. One man laughed and said, "I think you might be more tired than I was." By the end of that first week, Hildur had contacted 9 of the 11. Same story every time. Pleasant, slightly baffled people who remembered a brief power outage and nothing more. The 2 she couldn't reach were the 67-year-old man from Bay 9, the one who'd been standing at the window, and a woman from Bay 6, a 34-year-old named Disa Haraldsdottir, who'd been in for an allergic reaction. The Bay 9 patient, Jon Christiansen, had been discharged the morning after the blackout and didn't answer his phone. His listed address was in Breitholt, and when Hildur drove there on her day off, a neighbor told her John had gone to stay with his daughter in Akureyri and hadn't said when he'd be back. Disa Haraldsdottir was different. She called Hildur back. She said, "I remember all of it." Disa and Hildur met at a coffee shop on Laugavegur on a Saturday afternoon, 8 days after the blackout. Disa was a graphic designer, small, direct, with a kind of nervous energy that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. She ordered a double espresso and started talking before Hildur had taken off her coat. "The stars had surfaces," Disa said. "That's what I keep coming back to. They weren't points, they were objects. I could see the curve of them. I know how that sounds." Hildur sat down. "It sounds exactly like what I saw." "I wasn't having an allergic reaction," Disa said. "I mean, I'd eaten shrimp. I was covered in hives. They'd given me adrenaline. But during the blackout, the hives went away. Not faded, went. My throat had been swelling, and it just wasn't anymore. And I was looking at the ceiling, except there was no ceiling. The roof of the hospital wasn't there. I could see straight up through it, through the floors above, through the roof, into that sky." Hildur asked her about the flat line, whether she'd felt anything when her heart stopped. "My heart didn't stop," Disa said. "Something else started. I don't know what. But I wasn't dead. I was more awake than I've ever been. I could feel the building, the pipes under the floor, the hot water running through them. I could feel the heat of it. Not on my skin, inside me. Like it was circulating through me the same way it was circulating through the pipes, like I was part of the system." Hildur wrote this down. She asked if Disa had spoken to anyone else about it. "My partner thinks I had a hypoxic episode from the allergic reaction. My GP referred me to a psychologist. I went once. She was very kind. She said near-death experiences are well documented and that the brain produces extraordinary imagery under metabolic stress." Disa paused. "The thing is, I wasn't under metabolic stress. The adrenaline had already worked. My airway was clear. I was fine. And then I was better than fine. And then the lights came back and I was just a woman with hives again." Over the following month, Hildur found 4 more people who remembered. Not patients, civilians, people who'd been awake and outside during the 9 minutes. She found them through the only method available. She asked. She talked to colleagues, friends, strangers in swimming pools and grocery stores. She developed a question that functioned as a filter. "Did you see the stars on the 14th? Most people said no, or looked confused, or talked about the cloud cover. But occasionally, someone's expression would change. Their eyes would go still, and they'd say something like, 'You saw them too.' The 4 she found were a bus driver named Stefan, who'd been on the Route 1 heading down Reykjavik when his bus lost electrical power and coasted to a stop. A university student named Birta, who'd been walking home across Hljomskalagardur Park. A retired fisherman named Gunnar, who'd been sitting in the hot pot at Sundhallen's swimming pool. And a teenager named Aron, 17 years old, who'd been skateboarding in Ostervoller Square when the streetlights went out. 6 witnesses, including Hildur and Disa. 6 people who remembered the sky opening. None of them had been asleep. All of them had been physically active or alert at the moment of the blackout. And all of them described the same sensory experience, not just the stars, but the heat. The feeling of the geothermal system moving through them. The sense that, for 9 minutes, the boundary between their bodies and the city's infrastructure had dissolved. It was Birta, the university student, who said the thing that redirected everything. Birta was 22, studying geophysics at the University of Iceland. She'd been walking through the park, had seen the sky, and had stood in the snow for the full 9 minutes, staring upward. She was the most analytically minded of the group, and the least frightened. "You're asking the wrong question," she told Hildur at their first meeting. "Everyone keeps asking what happened to the power grid. The power grid is a symptom. Ask what happened to the geothermal field. Birta had access to the university's seismological data through her coursework. She'd pulled the records for February 14th. During the 9-minute window, the network of seismometers on the Reykjanes Peninsula, the geologically active zone southwest of Reykjavik, recorded a signal she'd never seen before. Not an earthquake, not tremor activity, a standing wave. A single, continuous, low-frequency oscillation at 7.83 Hz that appeared across all stations simultaneously, lasted exactly 9 minutes and stopped. 7.83 Hz is the fundamental Schumann resonance, Birta said. It's the baseline electromagnetic frequency of the Earth's surface ionosphere cavity. It's always there, everywhere on the planet, all the time. It doesn't show up on seismometers. Seismometers measure ground motion, not electromagnetic oscillation. This should not have appeared on those instruments. She paused, scrolling through the waveform data on her laptop screen. Unless the ground itself was resonating at that frequency, unless, for 9 minutes, the rock under Reykjavik was vibrating in sympathetic resonance with the global electromagnetic field. Which would mean the geothermal system wasn't just carrying heat, it was carrying information. I need to stop here and address something directly, because I can feel some of you reaching for the word, not aliens. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because that word is a trapdoor. The moment you say it, every subsequent observation falls through it and lands in a category that allows people to stop thinking. This is not a story about aliens. This is a story about infrastructure. Reykjavik is built on top of one of the most geologically active zones on Earth. The city heats itself by drilling into that geology and extracting hot water. It has done this in some form since the 1930s. The borehole network under the city is extensive, hundreds of wells, some reaching depths of 2,000 meters. Tapping into reservoirs heated by magma chambers that sit along the mid-Atlantic ridge, where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are pulling apart at a rate of about 2 centimeters per year. What Birta was suggesting was not that something alien had visited Reykjavik. She was suggesting that something geological, something native to the system the city had been tapping for almost a century had, for 9 minutes, done something the city's engineers had never anticipated. The question was not, what came to Reykjavik? The question was, what has Reykjavik been sitting on top of this whole time? 6 weeks after the blackout, Hildur received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. It was John Christiansen, the 67-year-old from Bay 9, the one who'd been standing at the window. He was back from Akureyri. He wanted to meet. He sounded tired. They met at his flat in Breitholt. It was small, tidy, full of books. He made coffee in a French press and didn't say anything for a while. Then he told her he'd gone to Akureyri because he'd been frightened, and that he'd come back because the fear had changed into something else. I was looking out that window, John said, and I could see down, not just up, down through the floor, through the concrete, through the rock. I could see the boreholes, the water, the heat. It was a system, Hildur, a circulatory system, like veins, and it was alive. Not alive like an animal, alive like a weather pattern. Moving, shifting, responding to pressure and temperature and something else. Something I could feel but not name. He stopped, took a drink of his coffee. The thing I went to Akureyri to get away from the thing that brought me back is that when I was standing at that window, the system noticed me. Not me specifically. All of us. Everyone in the city. It noticed that we were there. And I don't think it had noticed before. Birta Jonsdottir did not have a laboratory. She had a laptop access to publicly available seismological databases, and the stubborn focus of a geophysics student who was supposed to be writing her thesis on glacial isostatic adjustment, but had instead spent 6 weeks staring at a waveform that shouldn't exist. What she found was that the 7.83 Hz signal on February 14th was not an isolated event. It had happened before, many times. Going back through the seismological archive, Birta identified 17 occurrences of the same standing wave signature in the Reykjavik network over the previous 12 years. All had the same frequency. All appeared simultaneously across all stations. And the durations formed a sequence. The earliest she could find was in October 2012. It lasted 41 seconds. The next, in March 2013, lasted 55 seconds. Then a minute 12. Then a minute 40. She plotted the durations. They were increasing, not linearly, logarithmically. Each interval was longer than the last by a ratio that decreased over time, approaching a curve. The February 14th event, at 9 minutes, fell exactly on that curve. And the curve, when she projected it forward, reached a limit, an asymptote, a duration beyond which the signal would not grow because it would become continuous. According to her model, that limit would be reached in September 2024. 7 months away. She brought this to Hildur. Hildur brought the group together, all 6 of them, at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning in late March. Coffee, Kleinur pastries, and a laptop showing a logarithmic curve that suggested the ground under Reykjavik was going to start vibrating permanently in 7 months. The conversation was difficult. Not because anyone doubted Birta's data, the seismological records were public. The signal was there. The math was straightforward. It was difficult because they didn't know what to do with it. Gunnar, the retired fisherman, said they should contact the Icelandic Met Office. Hildur said she'd already tried. She'd sent an email to the Geohazards Division in late February, describing the water surplus and requesting a review of the seismological data. She'd received a polite reply, thanking her for her concern, and noting that no anomalous seismic activity had been recorded on the date in question. "The signal is in their data," Birta said. "I pulled it from their public archive. They either haven't looked at it or they've looked at it and don't know what to make of it." Stefan, the bus driver, said something that shifted the room's mood. He said, "My bus's electrical system died during the blackout. Every bus on the route died. But the next morning, when I reported it, my supervisor said the fleet tracking showed all buses operating normally during that window. GPS, telemetry, everything. The system said my bus was running. I was sitting in it in the dark." Silence. "It's not that people forgot," Desa said slowly. "It's that the records forgot. The data forgot." Birta went further into the archives. She wasn't just looking at seismological data anymore. She was looking at everything: weather records, utility data, hospital admissions, traffic patterns, anything that generated a timestamp and a measurement during the previous 17 events. The pattern held. Each event corresponded to a brief period during which automated systems continued recording normal operation while physical reality diverged. The divergence was local, limited to the greater Reykjavik area. And the divergence was selective. It didn't affect everything. It affected systems that were connected to the geothermal infrastructure. Traffic cameras failed during the events, but their servers logged continuous footage. Flow meters at Veitur showed normal consumption, while reservoir levels told a different story. Hospital monitors ran on battery, but wrote no data to the network. The grid SCADA system, the supervisory control that managed electrical distribution, generated logs with clean, normal-looking readings that bore no relationship to what was actually happening on the wires. The geothermal system isn't being disrupted during these events, Berta said. It's being used. Something is running on it. The hot water, the boreholes, the pipe network. Their infrastructure for something. And during these events, that something takes priority. Our systems keep recording because they're designed to record. But they're recording what the geothermal network tells them, not what's actually occurring. The network is feeding them normal data to keep them quiet. Like an immune response, Disa said. Like it's keeping the host organism calm while it does something. Hildur stared at the curve on Birta's screen. And in September, it stops needing to keep us calm. In May, Hildur went back to the hospital. Not for her shift. She'd taken leave in April, citing accumulated overtime. She went to find the patients. She tracked down 8 of the 11 who had flatlined during the blackout. The 3 she couldn't reach had moved. Died of unrelated causes, per the records, or simply didn't answer. The 8 she found were all fine. Normal lives. No lingering symptoms, no memories of the event. Except 3 of them had made changes. Not dramatic, not conscious changes. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you were looking for it. The woman from Bay 3 had started taking cold water swims at Nautholsvik Beach. Daily. She couldn't explain why. She'd never been a swimmer. A man from Bay 11 had quit his desk job at an insurance company and taken work at the Hellischeide geothermal plant. He said it just felt right. He said the sound of the turbines calmed him. A woman from Bay 2 had moved from her flat in the city center to a farmhouse in Hveragerði, the small town 30 minutes east of Reykjavik that sits directly on top of an active geothermal field. She said she'd been having trouble sleeping in the city and had felt better the moment she'd arrived in Hveragerði. Like the ground was holding me, she said, and then laughed at herself. Hildur wrote it all down. She did not tell these people what she suspected, because she did not yet know what she suspected. She only knew that 11 people had been clinically dead for 7 minutes, that the geothermal system had been the only infrastructure still functioning correctly during the blackout, and that some of those people were now, without knowing why, arranging their lives around proximity to geothermal heat. June, midsummer, endless daylight. Birta called Hildur at 2 in the morning. Not that it mattered, since the sun was up, and told her to come to the university. Birta had gained access to the kilometer data. A kilometer is a laser instrument that measures cloud height by firing a beam straight up and timing the return. The Reykjavik kilometer runs continuously from the Met Office site at Bústaðavegur. During each of the 17 historical events, the kilometer had recorded a momentary anomaly. The laser pulse went up. It did not come back. The return time should be microseconds, Birta said. The clouds were at 200 meters. The laser fires, bounces off the cloud base, comes back. Simple. During each event, the laser fired, and the return dropped to 0. Not a long delay. 0. No return at all. The laser went through the clouds. The laser went through where the clouds should have been and didn't hit anything. Either the clouds weren't there, which contradicts the satellite thermal data, or the laser went through the clouds and kept going and never came back, which means it went into something that doesn't reflect light. Hildur looked at the data. 17 events, 17 zero return windows, each one coinciding exactly with the standing wave signal on the seismometers. What's above the clouds? Hildur asked. Atmosphere, stratosphere, space. What if it's not? Birta looked at her. What do you mean? What if, above Reykjavik, there's something between the clouds and space? Something that's usually closed. Something that opens. I'm going to tell you what Hildur's working theory became, not because I think it's correct, but because it's the most internally consistent explanation anyone has offered for the full range of data. The geothermal system under Reykjavik is not just a geological feature. It is a boundary, a membrane between the surface of the Earth and something else. Something below and above, simultaneously. Something that exists in the deep rock, and in the upper atmosphere, and possibly in the space between. The boreholes drilled over the past century didn't just tap into hot water. They punctured a membrane that had been, for lack of a better word, sealed. The 17 events Birta identified are the membrane opening. Each time, it opens wider and stays open longer. Each time, the geothermal system, the water, the heat, the network of pipes, carries something to the surface that doesn't belong in the electromagnetic spectrum as we understand it. The standing wave, the sky anomaly, the effect on biological systems. And each time, the membrane closes again, and the systems return to normal, and the data smooths itself over, and Reykjavik forgets. But Reykjavik isn't forgetting on its own. The system is making it forget. The geothermal network, the infrastructure, the hot water in the pipes, it's delivering a signal that overwrites the disruption, normalizes the instruments, blanks the records, soothes the minds. It's been doing this for at least 12 years, and it's getting harder. The surplus water, the 83,700 cubic meters, is the effort. The energy cost of making a city of 140,000 people, forget what they saw. And in September, according to Birta's curve, it won't be able to do it anymore. August 2024, 5 weeks before the projected asymptote. Reykjavik in late summer, long days shortening noticeably, tourists thinning, the first suggestion of winter in the North Atlantic wind. Hildur had not returned to work. She'd been living on savings and spending her days doing something she'd never imagined herself doing. Field work. Not with instruments, she didn't have any. With her body, walking the city's geothermal infrastructure on foot. She walked the pipe routes, not the streets above them, the actual routes, traced from Veitur's publicly available distribution maps. She walked from the Perlan Reservoir down through the neighborhood lines, following the buried mains under Skulagata, Verfisgata, Laugavegur, down to the harbor. She walked out to the Deildartunguver borehole field. She walked the service roads at Hellisheidi. She said later that she was listening, not with her ears, with something else. Something the 9 minutes had left in her. A residual sensitivity to the movement of hot water through rock and pipe and soil. She said the system had a sound. Not audible, not exactly. A texture, a pulse. And it had been getting faster. She brought Disa and John on some of these walks. Disa could feel it too. She'd been feeling it since the blackout. A low hum in her sternum when she stood over a geothermal main. John felt it differently. He said it was in his bones. He said it felt the way the sea felt when you'd been on a trawler for 3 weeks, and the swell became part of your body's rhythm. He said the city had a swell, and it was building. The group met for what Hildur called the practical conversation on August 28th. All 6. Her kitchen table again. No pastries this time. Birta laid out the model, the curve, the asymptote in mid-September, the prediction. The standing wave would become continuous, the membrane would open and not close, and the normalization signal, the thing that made the city forget, would fail permanently. What happened after that? She could not model, because her data only described the approach, not the arrival. Gunnar asked the fisherman's question. Is it dangerous? Nobody answered for a while. Then Hildur said, 11 people had no heartbeat for 7 minutes and were fine, more than fine. Some of them are reorganizing their lives around geothermal proximity without knowing why. The system didn't hurt anyone. It sustained them. But those 11 people were in a hospital, in a controlled environment, for 9 minutes. If the membrane opens permanently, the entire city will be exposed to whatever that was. Indefinitely, without medical support, without any understanding of what's happening to them. We tell people, Aaron said. The teenager. He'd been mostly quiet at these meetings, listening. We go public. We tell everyone. Tell them what? Stefan said. The hot water is alive and the sky opens sometimes? Will sound insane. We have data, Birta said. Data nobody's willing to look at, Hildur said. I've sent it to the Met Office, the university, the Civil Protection Authority. Nobody responds. Not because they're covering it up, because the data doesn't register to them. They look at it and see normal readings. The normalization effect isn't just in the instruments. It's in the people reading the instruments. Except us, Disa said. Except us. Here's what Hildur decided. And I want to be clear that this was Hildur's decision, not arrived at by consensus, not sanctioned by any authority, not endorsed by the group as a whole. Birta disagreed with it. Gunnar thought it was premature. Stefan and Aron supported it. Disa said she'd follow Hildur's lead because Hildur was the only person who'd been thinking about this in practical terms since the beginning. Hildur decided that if the city couldn't be warned, if the normalization effect made warning impossible, because people literally could not perceive the warning as meaningful, then the 6 of them needed to be ready to act when the membrane opened permanently. They needed a plan for what to do when 140,000 people experience what 11 patients had experienced in a hospital bed. But without monitors, without staff, without walls. She'd spent her career managing the gap between what a patient was experiencing and what they needed. This was the same thing at a different scale. She contacted the 3 patients she'd found who were drifting toward geothermal sites. The swimmer, the plant worker, the woman in Reykjavik. She didn't explain the full picture. She told them a partial truth, that she was studying the effects of geothermal proximity on post-cardiac arrest patients, that she'd noticed their lifestyle changes, that she wanted to stay in touch. They all agreed. They all seemed relieved, in fact, as if they'd been waiting for someone to acknowledge that their new behaviors were connected to something real. She built a network, not a movement, not an organization, just a group of people who could feel the pulse in the infrastructure and were willing to pay attention to it. 11 patients who'd been changed without knowing it. 6 witnesses who knew exactly what had changed them. September 11th, 2024. 4 days before Birta's projected asymptote. Hildur was on a night shift at Landspítali. She'd returned to work in September because she wanted to be in the hospital when it happened. At 22:17, the lights flickered. Not a blackout, a flicker, half a second. The kind of thing that happens in any building, anywhere, and means nothing. But Hildur felt it, the pulse in the floor, the hot water in the pipes beneath the hospital surging just for a moment, like a heartbeat out of rhythm. She called Birta. Check the seismometers. Birta was already looking. The 7.83 Hertz signal was there. Faint, intermittent, not a sustained event, more like a tremor before an earthquake. A foreshock. Over the next 3 days, the flickers increased. Not in the lights, in everything. Brief moments when the geothermal pulse became perceptible to Hildur, Disa, John, and the others. A second of warmth in a cold room. A vibration in a coffee cup. The sense that the floor was breathing. On September 13th, Hildur went to Sundholm, the public swimming pool where Gunnar had been during the blackout. She sat in the hot pot, the circular geothermal pool fed directly by borehole water, and put her hands flat on the concrete rim. She could feel it, the membrane, thin now, almost transparent. The heat coming through the water was different, not hotter, deeper. It carried something that she could only describe as a tension, as if the vast thermal system under the city, the magma, the water, the rock, the boreholes, the pipes, all of it was pressing against the surface and listening. She stayed in the pool for 2 hours. When she got out, her skin was flushed and tingling, and she could see, very faintly, when she looked up at the overcast September sky, the ghost of a star. Just one, impossible through the clouds and the city light and the remnant brightness of the long northern evening. But there, September 15th, the date Birta's curve reached its asymptote. Hildur was on shift. She'd arranged it that way, traded with a colleague, worked extra days the previous week. She was in the emergency department at Landspítali at 2100 hours when the lights went out again. This time, the generators kicked in. 3 seconds of darkness, then the diesel hum and the emergency power. The fluorescence came back, slightly yellower than mains, but steady. The department was busy a Friday night in Reykjavik, means alcohol-related presentations, minor injuries, the usual. Nobody panicked. Power cuts happen. But Hildur felt the floor change under her feet. The pulse was continuous, not intermittent, not building. Arrived, steady, 7.83 hertz, humming up and through the concrete and the tile and the soles of her shoes. She looked at the other staff. Nobody else reacted. The normalization effect. They couldn't feel it. She looked at the monitors. All reading normal. Patients stable. Nothing clinical happening. She walked to the window. The clouds were gone. Not the whole sky, just a circle. Directly above the city, a ring of clear darkness, maybe 10 kilometers across, and through it, the stars, the real ones, the ones with surfaces and depth and color. The membrane was open. Hildur stood at that window for a long time. She watched the stars. She felt the pulse in the floor. She listened to the hospital functioning around her, the monitors beeping, the ventilators cycling, the staff moving through their routines, and she waited for the 11 flat lines, for the cascade, for the crisis she'd spent 7 months preparing for. It didn't come. Nothing happened. That's the part I keep turning over. Nothing happened. The membrane opened. The stars appeared. The geothermal pulse went continuous. And 140,000 people went about their Friday evening. Nobody collapsed. Nobody flatlined. Nobody lost consciousness. The pubs stayed open. The buses kept running. The hot water kept flowing. Hildur called Disa. "Can you see it?" "I'm looking at it right now. I'm on my balcony. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Nobody else can see it. I'm watching people on the street from the hospital window. They're not looking up. They don't need to, not yet. The system's not forcing anything. It's just open. It's waiting." Hildur called Birta next. Birta confirmed. The standing wave was continuous. The salometer return was 0. The seismological data showed a sustained 7.83 hertz oscillation with no sign of decay. The membrane was open and stable. "Is this it?" Hildur asked. "Is this the permanent state?" Birta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think so, but I think we're wrong about what that means. I thought the normalization would fail, that people would see what we see. But the normalization isn't failing. It's not even straining. It's just not needed anymore." "What do you mean?" "The system was using energy to keep the city unaware during the brief openings. 83,000 cubic meters of hot water for 9 minutes. That's enormous. But a permanent opening doesn't need concealment because it becomes the baseline. It's not an event anymore. It's the new normal. And normal doesn't require suppression. Normal is, by definition, what you don't notice." Hildur leaned against the window frame. Below her, Reykjavik hummed and glowed. The hot water circulated. The lights burned. People walked and drove and ate dinner and argued and kissed. Above them, through a gap in the membrane of the world, the actual cosmos looked down, with a patience that made geological time seem rushed. "So nothing changes," Hildur said. "Everything changed," Birta said. 7 months ago, or 12 years ago, or when they drilled the first borehole in 1930. I don't know, but the change already happened. This is just the moment it stopped hiding." Hildur finished her shift at 7 the next morning. She drove home in the gray September dawn. The gap in the sky was still there, but in daylight it was invisible, just the ordinary overcast, the ordinary light. She sat at her kitchen table. She opened the A4 notebook she'd started on February 14th. 11 pages of clinical notes. Then months of observations, data conversations, questions. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote, "September 16th, 2024. The membrane is open. No clinical events, no public awareness. The 6 of us can see it. The 11 patients from February 14th may be experiencing subclinical effects. 3 confirmed behavioral changes consistent with geothermal affinity. The broader population shows no acute response." She paused, thought about what to write next, decided on honesty. "I spent 7 months preparing for a crisis that didn't arrive. The system is not hostile. The system is not even interested in us the way I feared. It is interested in itself. We drilled into it, and it woke slowly over years. And now it is awake. And we are living inside something that is alive in a way I cannot define clinically or scientifically. And it doesn't need us to know this." She closed the notebook, opened it again. "But some of us know. And I think that matters. Not because we need to save anyone, nobody needs saving. But because someone should be paying attention. Someone should keep records that the system can't smooth over. Someone should stand at the window." She left the notebook open on the table. She made coffee. She sat in her quiet kitchen in Reykjavik, a city of 140,000 people, living in the body of something vast and newly conscious. And she drank her coffee, and she waited to see what the open sky would bring. She's still waiting. As far as I know, the sky is still open. I don't live in Reykjavik. I can't verify any of this with my own eyes. But I have the water data. I have the seismological records. I have the kilometer logs. I have Hildur's notebook, which she scanned and sent to me in October, all 206 pages of it. And I have one more thing. Last month, I flew to Keflavik and drove into the city on a Tuesday afternoon. Overcast, cold, standard. I went to Sundhallen pool and sat in the hot pot, the way Hildur had described. I put my hands flat on the concrete rim. I closed my eyes. I felt nothing, just hot water, just my own heartbeat. But when I opened my eyes and looked up at the low, gray sky, and I know how this sounds. I know, believe me, For just a moment, less than a second, I saw a star. One star, through the clouds, in the middle of the afternoon. And then it was gone. And the sky was ordinary. And I got out of the pool and dried off, and drove back to the airport and flew home. I'm telling you this because Hildur asked me to. Because someone should be paying attention. Because the data is public and the water records are real, and the seismological archive is available to anyone who knows where to look. Because a nurse in Reykjavik spent 7 months documenting something that the city itself was designed to forget. And the least I can do is pass it along. Look at the data. Look at the water surplus. Look at the 7.83 Hertz signal in the Reykjavik's seismological archive. Look at the ceilometer returns. And the next time you're in Reykjavik, if you go to the pool, if you sit in the hot water, if you put your hands on the rim and look up, tell me what you see.